break, and another 34% said it was important, but not quite essential. And so there are ways now that this switch to virtual life has amplified how important this infrastructure is for everybody.
Definitely increasing demand, without a doubt, and the critical nature. Mary Gwen, colleges and K-12 schools quickly moved to online platforms to ensure education continued during the pandemic. And students without access to the internet were immediately impacted. You saw this firsthand in Louisville, Kentucky, and Lee just shared the statistics from Pew about the number of individuals and families without access, either because of limited internet, limited device, sometimes as a part of income, and school children doing their schoolwork on a cell phone. It's really hard to imagine. In what ways have you seen schools and colleges step in to make sure learning has continued for students the last few months? And you're on mute.
Yep, thank you.
You're welcome.
So by now everybody's very familiar with the Herculean efforts that schools, teachers, families, universities, colleges made to shift to online platforms. And first that was in an emergency mode. When the nature of the coronavirus spread became clear, it was up then to finish out the school year. And now it's uncertain whether they'll be able to start up in person in the fall, and all are making plans for a variety of scenarios. And those most impacted, of course, as we're seeing in so many ways in this pandemic, are the vulnerable populations, the low income, rural and tribal students without internet access or those devices, as you said. There's three basic components of the challenge for schools. You know, it's devices, it's the internet access, and it's the quality of instruction. And I'm not going to really focus much on that, nor am I really an expert, but suffice it to say there are a lot of questions about how to engage students, what platforms provide those interactive opportunities, but also this question of synchronous or asynchronous. So whether you can do things at the same time, where the cell phone really becomes important. Are you really trying to interact with, a whole classroom via a cell phone? Raises that up. And I'd just like to share the, let's see if I can do this. I'm going to try to share my screen. The statistics in Louisville are very similar. Did that come up? Maybe not. Okay, do you all see the screen?
I do not.
My data? Let's see. I had just done this before. Oh, I see what I need to do. I apologize. We practiced this beforehand. I just need to do it.
We are in a fail forward environment these days, so, but this will be success forward.
Try one more time. Share screen. No, it's not working. So let me just say that, yes, we had about 26% of students in Louisville. We have about, this is data that the Kentucky Interworks, our workforce board, said we have about 26% who have no desktop or laptop. So this is access to digital devices. Of that, 9% had no computer and 10% had a smartphone only. And then another 7% had a tablet or computer, but no real device. That was, and the spread of that is highly concentrated in our low-income areas and those with heavily African-American or immigrant populations. In our internet access, we're closer to 29%. And there it was, no internet subscription was about 16%, and a cell plan only about 13%. So, and again, concentrated heavily in the low-income areas. So how did schools and universities respond? JCPS distributed over 20,000, that's our public school system, over 20,000 Chromebooks. They first reached out to philanthropy to see if we could pay for this, but as the CARES fund came in, they realized they could cover that. the Wi-Fi access, they also wanted to try to distribute hotspots, and they were able to prioritize special needs students and distribute about 1,000 of those. But there were difficulties in the supply side. Not enough, providers had them to provide, and they had to get a cost. And there are questions rising about, is that really the school system's job to get Wi-Fi internet? And there's legal questions arising, and responsibility questions. So we can come back to that later in the discussion. But I also want to say about universities and colleges, they also opened up parking lots with Wi-Fi access, and rose to the challenge of trying to refurbish old computers to reach. But there were equal impacts on those kinds of students not being able to access. And all this is in an environment where blended learning and some kind of hybrid model is clearly the way of the future. There's no turning back. So we really have to meet these challenges.
Yeah, so there was clearly a strong rapid response in the immediate wake of this pandemic. But now we have a few months to really figure it out as a more systemic response before we return to school. Mary Gwen, to your point, likely a hybrid model for school.
Right, and just a quick point on that, summer is often the time when learning is catching up, but that's not really possible now either. And for those who've been left behind, there's a real concern even for the out of school time providers who were maybe community centers and whatnot that were providing, they're not able to reach either. And those staff are often low income as well and don't have devices. So there's this whole aspect of workers as well being able to participate.
Yeah, absolutely. So Peter, MACID has been engaged in its own broadband campaign for some time. A recent op-ed that you published in the Lexington Herald Leader said internet service providers should immediately make basic internet access available for free to everyone in the state for the duration of the state of emergency. What was the provider reaction to your statement?
Sorry, I think I could sum it up with the word crickets. We did not hear from any providers relative to this proposal. We intended that to be a provocative proposal, and to be fair, it's not entirely up to the providers to figure this out. We really need, as a society, to think differently about what internet access means and what equity means when internet is so central to all of our lives as it is today, even before this crisis. And this crisis has just lifted this up as it has so many other inequities in our nation. As we look at the region of Eastern Kentucky that MACID serves, we see much higher poverty rates, much higher incidence of health issues and other problems, educational attainment, than we see even in other parts of the state. But in many ways, it is similar to rural areas across the state and really rural areas all over the nation. And when we talk about broadband in rural areas, we almost immediately and automatically go to infrastructure. And we know that it's hard to build infrastructure in rural areas, and it's not profitable to build infrastructure in rural areas. When we faced this question with electrification in the 1940s, we took it on as a national initiative, and the RECCs were formed, the rural electrification, to push it out into places where the for-profit businesses simply were never going to build those lines. We need to think about it the same way with internet, but it goes far beyond infrastructure. And to get at that, I'd like to cite some data from a study that was done recently by UK's Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky, CEDIC. And they did a study that looked at broadband in every county in the state. And I want to pull up a couple of those counties to do a comparison, because I think it gets at a critical point. First, I want to talk about Jackson County. Jackson County is an economically distressed county. And when we say economically distressed, This is a specific category that's established by the Appalachian Regional Commission, and it means if you look at the per capita income, the percentage of families in poverty, and the 3-year unemployment rate, that these counties fall in the bottom 10% of all the counties in the nation. Both counties that I'm going to talk about today have got very similar demographics when we look at those numbers, but very different internet access. In Jackson County, the internet runs to every household in the county. SEDIC identified 0% of people without access to fixed broadband of at least 25 Mbps and 3 Mbps for upload. So at least 25 megabytes per second. What we see in Jackson County with this universal access is actually gigabit internet, 1,000 Mbps to every household. Now, just a few miles away in Leslie County, only 50% of the people have access to that fixed wired internet. And their median maximum advertised download speed is 15 Mbps. That's 15 versus 1,000. So this is a completely different 2 orders of magnitude in terms of the kind of infrastructure that is available. The reason for that, quite simply, is that People's Rural Telephone in Jackson County, headed by Keith Garrett, has done an amazing job of providing the leadership to build out that access. Now, here's the flip side of that coin. As I said, both these counties have very similar demographics in terms of income and poverty rates. And in fact, they both have about the same percentage of households with no internet access. So the barrier in this case is not all about the infrastructure. It's about people not being able to afford the infrastructure even where it does exist. So we need to keep building infrastructure. We're not going to get a lot of infrastructure built in a few months during a pandemic. But what we could do right away is to flip the switch and turn on that internet access that already exists for these households where the wire runs to it, but the people can't afford to have it turned on. Now, we could make that some limited access. If you want the free access, you're only going to get this. If you want faster speeds, more bandwidth, you pay for it. So those of us who are already paying for internet, obviously we all have it. We're here on Zoom. We'd continue to pay for our internet, but the providers could actually be building their client base of tomorrow by providing that access for free today. I remember when they took down the toll booths on the Mountain Parkway because the parkway was paid for. And now it's a public good. You don't think about having to stop and toss coins in the slot to drive through a toll booth. And I think it's time to say the same thing with the internet. You know, it's out there. Let's let everybody drive.
Yeah, that's an excellent point about letting everyone drive and the internet being a public good. So Lee, on that note, I'd like to turn to you for some sense from you as how Americans tend to view government's role in providing access to the internet. And do you see that changing? Oh, and you're on mute.
Sorry. You would think that in an environment where so many more people are now thinking the internet is essential for accomplishing the things they want to do in their lives, that there would be a little bit more political support for a more aggressive government role in paying for this. We found the opposite when we did our recent survey. The same survey where we asked, is the internet is essential or not? We also asked, should it be the government's responsibility, at least during the coronavirus outbreak? You know, not for good and for all, but just during a period when it's so clearly useful to people and they can articulate the ways that it's useful. And the public does not support that as a rule. 62% of Americans don't support a role for government in that. 65% don't support it for cell phone connectivity. So both broadband and cell phone are not supported. What they do support, though, is something Mary Gwen was talking about, is they're much more open to the idea of providing it to children, especially in educational circumstances. And we asked the question more in the context of, should schools provide it? So obviously that's a different level of government. But there is a strong support, and it's bipartisan support, unlike the partisan breaks when it comes to overall broadband access or cell access. A lot of people support the idea of giving, a vast majority support the idea of giving computers and connectivity to students who can't afford it. But even a substantial minority say that every student ought to get it, just because it's so now, it's an essential tool of education.
And how about remote work, Lee? In the surveying you've been doing, the research you've been doing, even in the midst of, it sounds like some of that's been through the COVID-19 months.
Yeah.
What's the response from a remote work standpoint, or kind of economic productivity in a remote work?
Well, just echoing Peter's comments, people would love the fastest, speediest bandwidth connection that they could possibly get. What's most interesting about the work circumstances is that there are a lot of people who had at least occasional telework experiences. Every once in a while they could work from home, or every once in a while they could shift their activities from an office to home. Now, of course, that's the standard for many, many people, particularly in information intensive industries and knowledge industries and things like that. One of the new divides that's opened up in the country that's been accentuated by the outbreak, of course, is people who have jobs where they physically have to show up. And it's a large share of the population. It's particularly important for workers who are on the front lines and don't necessarily have knowledge generating jobs, but they've got to drive a truck, or they've got to deliver things, or they've got to physically be someplace to be where their boss needs them to be. And so there are ways in which now that those who can afford to work from home and those who are encouraged to work from home are in very different circumstances, often safer circumstances than people who are out in the front lines delivering the goods and services and healthcare that people need. So there's a sense that the telework environment is now becoming much more important. It'll be really interesting to see what happens to workspaces now that so many people have gotten used to the new norms and the new practices and the new activities that they can do online. But that's not everybody's circumstances.
Mm-hmm. How often is Pew surveying? Do you have other surveys like that will be coming up in the next few months to see any change in sentiment as this pandemic is elongated?
Yes, we are in the field usually 2 times a month, so 2 surveys per month, 24 times a year. The center is made up of a variety of units. The technology unit that I run is one of 10. And so there are other units that look at economics and healthcare. There are other units that look at the politics of this. We've been doing a lot of new survey work about people's mental health responses to this. And about 1/3 of Americans are really hurting. They are feeling depressed or anxious or isolated and things like that. So we're generating material multiple times a week. Once we get those surveys back, we often have questions about different topics, some technology, some about the politics of it. Did the country open up too soon? Or how comfortable would you personally feel going back to work? So we'll be getting new information about the essential nature of the internet, some of the new activities that people are doing. We're asking brand new questions now we've never had to ask before about whether people have done a virtual workout in their living room, because they used to do that at health clubs. And we now know that they're doing that and having virtual parties and virtual movie watching things. So we're in the field a lot, and we'll have a lot more to say in the coming months.
Great, great. So Mark, thinking about the demand side with remote work and businesses in rural areas, Peter mentioned the difference in Jackson County with the rural telephone leading the way versus other counties. You're representing the Kentucky Farm Bureau, and as you mentioned at the beginning, this has been on the Farm Bureau's legislative agenda for a decade. And it's coming out of, I'm sure, the remote business environment, right? Can you share a little more about that?
One of the most important things that to us in Farm Bureau is about rural development. We know that our rural communities, not only in Kentucky, but in rural America, has to really be connected. We have to have the connectivity. We have to be able to grow those communities for our children and our grandchildren to not only be educated and really be connected to the world, but we want them to be able to have a life, employment, and be able to live in rural Kentucky and rural America. I'm going to use myself as an example. Our family, we're in the orchard business, as you know, been in it for 150 years. And we have an on-farm retail market with a bakery and all the agritourism that goes with that. And that's a push for Farm Bureau and agriculture right now, is to have really buy local, be able to supply food to the consumer. We have to be connected to be able to do that. More than 90% of my advertising is on social media. I have to be connected to be able to swipe credit cards. I have to be able to not only advertise my products, but my customers have to be connected to receive that. So it becomes so much more critical for us. And then move a little farther on out into the rural area, and we've got farmers that predict or they depend on GPS to be able to operate their equipment. And it is so vital and important to be able to do that. You know, I'm glad we talked about the rural electrification early on. And that was such an important role for rural Kentucky and rural America. And we saw that, and my forefathers and ancestors, they worked hard to be able to make that happen. Yet today, we would like to be able to tag on to that line that already runs into the house, that the connection is there. We have to bring rural electric co-ops on board. We have to bring providers to the table to be able to make that happen. That can happen. And one of the things I would like to say before I stop here, we have gone an extra effort, and right now, we're in the process right now, working with Land O'Lakes has asked the Farm Bureau systems all across America to make Wi-Fi possible to the public in every place you can. So we have, right now are lighting up 16 regional offices across Kentucky where anyone can come to the parking lot and get access. And we're in the process also of expanding that into all 120 counties. So you can go to a Farm Bureau office in coming days and be able to do your schoolwork, be able to do, if you're traveling and need some, to work with data, you will have access to be able to do that, and it'll be secure. And we're spending a lot of money to be able to offer that as a short-term fix while we're really focusing on the bigger problem.
Yeah, it's important to underscore that as a short-term fix.
Yes.
So, you know, as we think about the stories we've heard, one that stays front and center for me is one of my coworkers who lives in a rural area outside of Lexington, Kentucky, where the internet access is not stable. He's not able to connect directly at his house. And he's trying to work remotely, and his daughter is trying to learn remotely. And so to think about a long-term fix being having to drive to a parking lot, which is a wonderful community offering right now from the Farm Bureau and from our community colleges and others, that they're making that happen. But again, it's a short-term fix. 6 months from now, we certainly don't want to be in an environment where individuals who are working and their children are trying to learn have to drive in to a parking lot to take care of those things. So
Exactly.
Thank you to the Farm Bureau and to others listening who have been part of that really rapid response. And we certainly need to be all in on a more systemic long-term fix. Mark, you mentioned the rural co-ops. Is the Farm Bureau working directly with any of the rural co-ops to move in that direction? And what's that conversation been like?
We are. Thank you, Bridget. We before the pandemic closed down that sent us all home, we had one meeting of the Broadband initiative, or a task force group that had most every stakeholder in Kentucky involved in it. And we met in Frankfort, had one initial meeting and conversation, just like we're having today, about what can we do to harvest the low-hanging fruit first, and then take steps to be able to move forward with the goal of being service to every Kentuckian and to every household. Electric co-ops were involved in the meeting. Providers were involved, and from all across the state, we had about 40 people there. We're going to bring that group back together. We're going to continue to work as a task force, both working what we can be able to do in Kentucky on a legislative or initiative, or through our agencies. But most importantly, we're going to continue to work with the focus that we have and the contacts we have through USDA right now, with Secretary Perdue is being able to award money for broadband, as you know, and expansion. So we stay in close contact with USDA, Secretary Perdue's people, and we're going to continue to focus on that. We have made great strides up until this point. There's been a lot of money awarded, as you know. Kentucky has been beneficial in that in recent months, but we're going to continue to focus on that. So yes, we think electric co-ops with the access they have is a key component.
So, and you mentioned the federal and the state component. So there, and as I mentioned at the beginning of our broadcast, we are pushing on Congress for funding for universal broadband, and that funding coming through the stimulus in some way as a more systemic response to a new normal. But there's also a state response, and Kentucky has put various initiatives together over the years as part of a state response. There will likely be continued push on our state legislature to ensure greater access. Mark, what's been, I guess, your experience with the state legislature the last 10 years in trying to move this issue of broadband forward? And then Peter, I'd like to have the same question to you from the Eastern Appalachian side of things.
We've had more movement in recent months, of course, and this last legislative session, the move was right. We encouraged really a piece of legislation to be moved forward, and it was House Bill 622 that basically set up a way to funnel money from both state and federal or wherever together to be able to access funding really from even from an individual or a group of individuals to be able to cost share, really build out. And that was kind of an initial step right there. We have a lot of our members that I talked about that are so in critical need for their business and extreme rural Kentucky that is willing and can provide some self-funding into this. But so we want to cost share, and if it's possible, and be able to move the needle some. Now it gets real touchy when you're talking about fixed wire, and then the areas that when you start talking about wireless, and there's two different opinions there of which is most effective and which is short term and which is more long term, and I completely agree with that. But I also know that if you're in need of service, you've got to have service. If you're in need of a water line, you got to run a small one if that's the best you can do at the time. We can't wait, I'm afraid, for the perfect scenario to come down the road. We can't wait years or a decade to get service. We have to get people connected as quick as we can.
So Peter Mace's been working on this issue for a long time as part of the growth in the economy in Appalachia. How do you see this state issue?
Sure. Well, you know, the access to broadband is one of many critical pieces that we've got to put together in order to build a new economy for Eastern Kentucky. And that's what we have to do, because the old economy is not coming back. And in fact, the old economy stifled the growth of a more diverse economy that would have made us better able to withstand what happened with the collapse of the coal industry in 2012. Now, you know, as we go into other economic upheavals like we're seeing now, these things are just magnified. The rest of the country recovered from 2008. You know, we didn't see that same recovery in these economically distressed counties. So it's a place where the differences that exist everywhere get magnified. Now, I want to give appropriate shout out to Congressman Rogers, who really has exercised enormous leadership in trying to bring broadband to Eastern Kentucky. The problem with that effort has been that it has focused on bringing that access to the county seats in all of these counties. And that doesn't address the need to get it to the last mile. That's where those farmers are that Mark is talking about. That's where those school children are. They're out there on the last mile, and it's just not reality that people are going to be able to meet that need by getting in a car and driving somewhere. As much as we appreciate the extraordinary access that has been provided with those short-term solutions. So we've really got to answer this dual question, which is, first, how do we get the internet to the last mile? And I would point again back to some of the utilities like People's Rural Telephone in Jackson County that solved that problem and actually did it. That's one piece. Then the other piece is, once we've got it there, how do we make sure that every household can connect? How can we make sure that we're addressing the equity issue as well as the infrastructure issue?
Yeah, great. Because to Lee's point in the survey results, if Americans want to make sure that school children can access the internet in a new normal, that's not needed just in our school buildings and in our libraries, but it's needed in children's homes and will be needed in children's homes. I want to.
That's right, Bridget. And we've seen in Jackson County, where there has been this universal access for several years now, there have been literally hundreds of jobs that have been created because people are able to work at home. And now, as working from home becomes more of the new norm, we actually have an opportunity to break down one of the key barriers to economic development in our region if we can push the access out there and make it available and affordable.
Okay, great. I want to take just a moment to thank our interpreter, Marva Johnson. She's with us just about every week, interpreting for the deaf and hard of hearing. Marva, thank you for being with us. And remind folks that we are taking questions in our Facebook Live comment stream. And I have a question now from a listener, Larry Holliday in Northern Kentucky, who asked, what impact did the early KET statewide cable access have on internet access? And does that early focus on networking for educational purposes still exist as a state priority? Lee, this may be applicable to you as you think about PBS kind of nationally driving some of this. But others want to comment on KET kind of leading the way here?
I don't know about connectivity in terms of internet access, but I can tell you that KET stepped up in a big way again in this time to make sure that there were, for those communities that had that had TV access, they'd be able to view educational content and really tried to align that with what the school agenda was and what the curriculum was. And so, yes, they will continue to be a very important fallback, but it's not interactive. And so, you miss the teacher ability to be able to connect directly with the student or for groups and peers. We're doing this Zoom where there's several of us and we can talk together. That's what's missing in the TV environment. But KET, it should be applauded for the way it did step up.
The other dimensions of the divide story, besides literally the access question and literally the affordability question, is that particularly now, 30 years into the advent of the World Wide Web, the people who don't now use these devices and have this kind of access are not necessarily primed from day one to know how to use these tools to best advantage, to know exactly where to go to get the best information. They're probably deeply aware of all of the problems that people now associate with connectivity: misinformation, hard to find accurate information, not, hackers are out there that will take over your wallets as well as your hard drives. And so the companion piece that we often see that is part of an expansion effort has to be, the tech support, the hand-holding, the teaching, the coaching to get people through these sort of fundamental issues related to literacy with new devices. These are not easy to use, intuitive devices. They take a little time, unless you're 15 years old, to master them all. And the second piece, which is related to the education content piece, is that there's a lot of junk out there. And so helping people find the most compelling, the most attractive, the most engaging material is a big burden on content creators and people who are on the other side of these interactive channels to make sure that their material is appropriate to their audiences, and make sure that it's understandable, and make sure that it's it holds their attention for more than a nanosecond, because now we have literally billions upon billions of other ways to spend our time with these devices if it's not done with good content. So there's a sort of second dimension to divides that needs to be tended to as well.
That's a really interesting layer, Lee, that we should give more thought to. Digital citizenship for sure, but also to Larry's question that we're in a much different time, and the internet is a much different beast than getting a public broadcasting access for more families and families in rural areas when there were just a few channels, and Sesame Street was a primary support for learning. Yet the internet is now and will continue to be a primary support for learning, and we need to
remember
equitable access.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Remember now that Sesame Street is on HBO and the app that's available there. So that's the new ways that people have pathways to information and content need to be considered through all of this.
Yeah, and the interactive piece, Mary Gwen, which you mentioned. So, and KET has been wonderful in getting resources broadcast out to rural areas for learning, but those resources are not interactive in the way that we need teachers facilitating instruction still in a hybrid learning environment. So it is, we don't have a lot of time to kind of evolve in the digital citizenship space. We've got to get it right. We've got to get it right fast. To support continued learning. So Lee, on that note, kind of bringing it back around to, to conversation about the stimulus in Washington, D.C., what are you hearing in D.C. About broadband being part of the stimulus package and Congress's commitment to broadband access as a public good? What is that conversation like?
It's on many people's wish lists on both sides of the aisle. I think the bigger question is whether another round of stimulus is going to be passed. There are enormous arguments about whether it's needed, whether it's affordable, and things related to that. If something does get passed, especially broadband access or some kind of extra funding for local initiatives, is very likely to be part of the package, as well as some form of economic aid, especially to municipalities and the healthcare system. But I can't put on my stargazer hat and figure out whether another bill is going to be passed. Mark is probably sort of closer to the action on that than even I am.
So, and the stargazer hat, and that's a question we just got from a listener, was just about that stargazer hat. So I'll throw this out for folks, and this is going to gauge like your pessimism, your level of pessimism versus or to optimism. What is the group's estimate of the time frame within which everyone might gain internet access, given the variety of funding and initiatives, state and national, being described? Can you summarize and guess a date for 100% connectivity?
I'm going to dodge your question in a clever way.
Okay.
In listening to Mark talk about the situation on farms, the thing that's now it's starting to emerge on farms and is going to be a reality in a very short amount of time is the smart farming piece. It's not just the GPS driven kinds of activities, but all sorts of new artificial intelligence systems and other analytics are going to be applied to farming in really interesting ways. So the next revolution in internet connectivity is going to be that the internet actually fades into the background. It's not necessarily the device, the machine, the computer, the thing that you swipe or you type on or even talk to. It's going to be the internet activity in the next 5 years is going to be so ubiquitous that people will benefit from it without necessarily thinking that they are in engagement with it. So I would say certainly by 2025, everybody will be an internet user, but they won't necessarily know so.
But does that mean they'll have access, Lee, by 2025 to be an internet user? If I'm living in a rural part of our nation, I have to have access, right?
Yep, and my guess is some combination of this next wave of technology deployment, the 5G, and the availability of spectrum for Wi-Fi kinds of systems. It might not reach every mountaintop or every holler, but it will be a lot more available and a lot more easy to use than it is today.
Okay. For those states and communities that really want to be part of this revolution, economic and educational revolution, it seems like a call to action right now. Mark?
I will say that that's one of our fears, that that the level of access is going to be sporadic. 5G is going to be absolutely in demand in urban areas, but we're so afraid that it's going to leave urban areas and even the outer portions of the middle mile that we talk about with gaping holes, much less the last mile. So I think Lee's exactly right. I think in 5 years from now we're going to be connected, but we're going to be connected at different levels. And I think there's going to be a lot of folks in agriculture. Agriculture, we have learned in the last 3 months, is definitely an essential workforce here. We have to feed our nation. And if we're going to be able to do that, we have to do it with a technology that's dependent on connectivity. And those folks have to get connected. Now, if they have to do it and bypass some of the more traditional efforts that we have to get everybody connected, I'm afraid that's what they're going to do. And that will leave even bigger holes or bigger gaps.
That will be a quality issue. Yeah.
Yes. And
Mary Gwen?
Yeah, I have a lot of optimism, Bridget, because what we've seen happen here, and I'm building on what Lee said in their surveying, that people understand the need and have a desire to do this for children. We've got the history of the E-rate, which is saying that all schools should have internet access, and it's now spreading to not only all schools, but students and teachers need to have that at home as well. And so what we learned in this time when there was great response was it can be done. And it actually wasn't as expensive as we thought. JCPS was able to get those Chromebooks out of existing dollars, and they're going to be able to use some of the stimulus for future. But when you take it as a percentage of their overall budget, it's kind of like textbooks or school buildings. It's an essential tool, as Lee said. And so we understand that. And so our educators in our schools may be the way to really push this and to close that digital divide, because we as a society are willing to do that so that our young people can learn. Universities and colleges are having to do it too, just to survive. Their cost model is being threatened right now in so many ways, but one of them is people are saying, am I really going to pay for a totally online experience? And so they're learning for ways to both not only try to get people back on campus, but how to make that online learning truly as valuable and as good as the others. So they're going to try to solve the problem. And as Peter said, it is about getting the infrastructure there, yes, but it's a lot about cost. And so if we just, and that's true in Louisville, we really do have this, infrastructure. What we don't have is the low-income students and the families of being able to actually pay for it and know how to use it. And I'll just close with, the workforce discussion that you've raised and others, that is the future where people, we know that the AI revolution is Kentucky has been shown to be one of the states that has the greatest risk of losing jobs to the AI revolution. The sooner that we can shift our economy where people are both digitally competent and have that digital literacy skills, but also have the access, the better we're going to be able to compete economically. So I think the imperatives are there, and we've shown that it can be done if we just have the will.
Peter, that's hard optimism to follow.
Well, from where we're working, we never lose sight of the fact that the coal fields of Appalachia literally fueled the growth of our entire nation and created a standard of living that's never been seen before in the history of humankind. And now these places bear the brunt in changes in the global economy that are far beyond their reach, but they're owed a debt for what they've contributed. And we think that debt can be paid with the investment that's needed to build a new economy. And the internet is just one piece of that. As Lee said, we'll never build out what we have today to everywhere because the next technology will overtake it. And as Mark said, these rural places will continue to be left behind. So if we look at just one thing as if it were going to be the answer, we'll never get there. But if we can take an integrated approach and the massive investment that's needed, we can create, again, prosperous communities in this region and across our state. And our rural places matter because we grow all the food, we provide all the water, we provide all the energy. The rest of America can't get by without rural America. It's a good investment.
Thank you, Peter. And we certainly, this conversation has underscored the interconnection between education and our economy. And to Mary Gwen's point, it really being on the forefront of this revolution will benefit Kentucky's economy and Kentucky's educational outcomes. For a state that's still fifth from the bottom of the nation in poverty, this is an opportunity for us to turn the corner on the inside of the curve into the future. And I certainly hope we figure out a way to embrace that. Mary Gwen, I appreciate you having 3 clear points of optimism there, that there's lots of work going on and we are going to figure it out. We at the Pritchard Committee plan to be behind a big push to figure that out and getting the funding to make it happen. And we appreciate each one of you panelists for joining us today to have a conversation about the digital divide, the critical demand side and the supply side to fix it. Lee will be following Pew's research and bi-monthly surveys to get that information out and continue to push on this issue as we move forward. Next week, we're hosting a special full week of conversations following the Pritchard Committee's call for racial equity and justice. Next week, all of our conversations will be framed around Black Minds Matter, and we'll be doubling down on that equity conversation in education to ensure that we deliver excellence for each and every one of our students in Kentucky, especially focusing on our students of color, our Black students, to raise those outcomes and to support them with the supports they need. So please watch for information on Black Minds Matter next week. Lots of information coming out. We'll follow this conversation with a blog and all the key points from our panelists, resources you can find in our Facebook comments. Please let us know if you have any follow-up questions and we'll get those answered. And again, we thank each one of you for joining us this afternoon and we'll stay in touch. Thank you all.
Thank you.